I loved the first Knives Out film. When I heard that they were making a second one, I was undeniably excited for it. I also didn't actually watch the first one until the second one was already announced. I literally watched it this Thanksgiving. I've owned it on Blu-ray for I can't tell you how long, but for whatever reason I just never watched it. So that all being said, me personally, I only had a 1-month wait for the second movie, and even still I can say it was worth every second. All the characters are so well written and they're either lovable and or hateable. The movie is very campy. I mean, everyone in it is a caricature of someone. I mean, Detective Blanc is a southern detective with a Kentucky deep-fried accent that's just honestly so much fun to listen to, and all the weird words and phrases he says are just glorious writing. It's so over-exaggerated and I love it. That being said, I'm sure for some viewers the movie coming off as this campy may not be their cup of tea, but I personally think that it makes this movie feel much more alive. This movie and the first is like a giant clue board. To the degree we're having one location where these movies take place is honestly to this movie's greatest strength. I think the scenes in Knives Out where they weren't at the Thrombey residence were honestly some of the weaker ones, so I love that in this movie we literally only stay at this island after they get there. I should also say when they leave an island that doesn't make a scene bad, but I think having this one enclosed locations where all our characters have to interact and try to make themselves seem innocent or guilty, I think it very much works toward this movie's strengths. I say that the characters are campy, and I say that the movies are caricatures, and I say that this movie is like a living clue board. But I say all that because you shouldn't take this movie too seriously if you really want to fully enjoy it. This movie is pretty silly. I mean, come on. One of the main characters of this film literally keeps his car on top of his house because he can't drive it on the island, and Detective Blanc just writes it off like it's the most normal thing he's ever heard. It's honestly hilarious. The whole movie's actually pretty funny. There's no really groan-worthy jokes. I think the jokes all land pretty well, especially anything that comes out of the detective's mouth. I love anything where the characters don't make jokes, but the things they say are still very funny. I think that's why I rated Black Adam a 7, even though it's really like a 5.5. But trust me, this movie actually deserves the score I'm going to give it. I've heard some people say that this movie is actually significantly more slapstick than the first, which I mean, to a degree I can agree with that. But you have to remember, in the first movie, a dog literally brings a piece of critical evidence to the detective's footsteps. Also, the main protagonist of the first movie throws up whenever she lies. Like, yeah, sure, this movie's slapstick, but the first one wasn't much more realistic anyway. But what makes Knives Out Mystery so great are the ways that they reveal the story to the viewer. In this film, there's a major twist for the entire second act, and it's honestly very good. In the first Knives Out movie, we learned how Harlan Thrombey actually died, but we spend the rest of the movie following our protagonist figuring out how much of it is the truth and how much of it is actually a lie. Both movies do tell the audience the truth, however, the writers keep facts that prevent us from solving the mystery before the movie's only an hour in, for obvious reasons. Glass Onion is very, very good at making you slowly figure out how everything in the first act makes sense through the second act. It's a very, very fun watch. Personally though, this movie is 2 hours and 10 minutes long, and although I do think it warrants that runtime, I think you could have probably shaved some off the second act. The second act serves entirely to fill out everything that we learned within the first act. And although I think they do that very well, I think once you've already watched the first act, going back through and learning all these new things isn't really going to be that interesting for a lot of people. I think that they do it in a very interesting way. I think the plot twist in the second act makes it so that this is all something, it's all new. It's all new information. We're not hearing the same things again, but you do want to go ahead and finish the story. You know what I mean? After you've watched them explain oh so much to you, even when there's still about 25% that you don't know yet, you're kind of like, okay, I'm so tired of learning all this other stuff. Can we finish the movie, please? I didn't feel that tired, but I feel like some people might feel that tired. I feel like they could have shaved it down just a little because my eyes were starting to glaze over just a little bit, but they really pick up in the third act to make it a lot more interesting and fulfilling, and the gotcha moment is very fun to watch. And a lot of the reason that the second act is engaging is because the editing is really smooth. You move through the scenes relatively fast. Don't get me wrong. Once again, 2 hour and 10 minute movie, and about 30 minutes of it are the scene that I am referencing it. 30 minutes, probably more. But they do a good job of cutting scenes together, making it very obvious what happens where, so you don't really need to worry about thinking about it too hard. Now, I do think the major twist of this movie is a little overused. They're not the first people to do it, not by a long shot, and it's a little bit of a groany, come on, really moment. But at the same time, I think it's very interesting, and they do it in a way where it actually feels somewhat believable. What kind of sucks is the ending of this movie isn't really that interesting. It's really 10 minutes of someone just enjoying the world's most expensive rage room, but I do think it makes sense why the character does this, but for so long, like, this scene had to be 5 to 10 minutes long, but only really the first 2 minutes and the last 2 minutes actually matter. However, I do think the end of the moment where the main character's like, "Gotcha, bitch," is pretty interesting, and it definitely made it very worth it. Though, when you watch the movie, or if you have already seen the movie, the legal ramifications behind what the main character did at that time have to have some serious legal ramifications. That's all I could think about. The movie doesn't go into it at the end, but that's all I could think about. One thing we need to touch on, the music in these movies, so good. Nathan Johnson does an amazing job at making a soundtrack that fit the theme and manages to keep this balance of suspenseful and light, and the use of string instruments really brings in a curious and inquisitive theme to the film. Before we close this out, I'm going to go into spoilers, not that much, so if you don't want to watch those, go ahead and skip to this timestamp if you are not interested in those. I'll give you a couple seconds to skedaddle. Right there. Alright, good. Alright. Okay. Although the plot twist with the sister is somewhat eye-rolling, I do think it's done well. Better than other movies have done it for sure. Especially revealing the twist after the sister dies is a pretty interesting way to reveal that to the audience. Because we think for the longest time while they were unveiling all this that, wow, now both of these sisters are dead and they've accomplished pretty much nothing. So that moment when we realize she's still alive is actually very much worth the payoff of the second act, I think. And the second act does a really good job at tying up every single loose end that you could possibly think of and probably didn't even remember. Like, I remember the scene where they find Helen stumbling drunk, and I was just like, okay, I didn't think anything of it in the first act, but then when they tie it up in the second act and we learn that she's drunk, it becomes so much clearer, but I would have never even thought about it ever again had they not mentioned it. I think it's really funny when Detective Blanc just ridicules Miles Braun for like 2 minutes straight during the entire breakdown. It's hilarious and says a lot about both of their characters. Braun isn't a smart guy. He's good at manipulation, which, to be fair, does require some intelligence. But it's mentioned that even his legal loophole that made his billions was made by his billion-dollar lawyers, not him. He was just good at being a dick. And the last thing I want to touch on before this video gets too long is how the napkin gets burned. It was a little unsatisfying. It was honestly a bruh moment for me. Like, I audibly said bruh when he just burned the napkin. Don't get me wrong, totally in character for Miles to do that to cover his tracks. He clearly already did worse. But I mean, that napkin lit up so incredibly fast. And I swear he wasn't even standing that close to Helen before the napkin even got lit up. I feel like had they shown him walking toward Helen, then it wouldn't have caught me off guard so much. So plugging all that in, I think this movie deserves an 8 out of 10. It's another enjoyable and really well-written mystery from Rian Johnson. I think the movies need to be just a little bit more realistic in the future. The twists do get kind of hard to believe at times, but if you're just looking for something fun to turn on and watch, easy 10 out of 10. It was one of the most enjoyable things I've seen all this year. Overall, Glass Onion is a movie you should definitely consider watching anytime you have the free time to do so. Oh, and also, Detective Blanc playing Among Us in this first scene of the movie gave it 2 extra points on the score.